So in my beginner series, in the drafting video, basic drafting, I had briefly touched on hatching. And it was very, very straightforward, just kind of like, here's hatching, here's how you do it, and that's it. But not really going over the options that are in the hatch properties and showing you what you can do with it and maybe some of the commands associated with it. So let's go over that now. To reiterate, a hatch is a automatically generated pattern inside of a closed boundary. And can't stress that enough. It has to be a closed boundary, or the hatch would go on infinitely. So you need to define a closed boundary. And the easiest way to give an example of this is just a rectangle, just a polygon. Now, this can be any kind of complex shape. And hatching, the hatch tool will always look for the smallest closed boundary. And I'll explain that with two rectangles. Let me just copy this over. And I'm going to draw a line through this one. So let's do a simple hatch. So here's our hatch icon. Okay, and it takes us to a hatch tool. And let's pick points. So I'm going to pick a point here. I'm going to set my scale to 10, and let's choose not great, but just, where's my crosshatch? ANSI 30. Where did it go? Okay. Now we're still a little big. Let's go 50. No, even bigger. 100. No, bigger. 200. That's better. Okay. So before I'm finishing the command here, I'm choosing all of my options, but we're starting with the basic hatch. I picked my pattern. By the way, I don't like this interface. It's the ribbon interface. It's nice because it is dynamic. I will give you that. It's dynamic, so it will update as you change some of the options, but picking a pattern is a pain sometimes. So, but I'm going to leave it because a lot of people are going to be using the ribbon more than anything else, so it's what it is. All right. We've picked a point, which is the biggest icon. It's how you start a hatch. You pick a point inside of a closed boundary. And we're going to right click and finish out. Now I'm going to go back to doing a hatch again. I'm going to go to this one this time, and I'm going to pick a boundary again. But you'll notice that the preview shows up on one half of this thing because it's using this line as my boundary. If I go to this side, it uses this side. Remember what I said. It's trying to pick an unobstructed closed boundary. So because I've drawn a line through this, I've obstructed this entire rectangle. I've made a new boundary inside here. There's a way to get around this. If you have a defined boundary, but you have objects running through it, you can instead select an object. Selecting an object will use that object no matter what's going through it. However, that object must be a polyline. It must be a closed boundary. Of some kind. It must be a closed boundary. So, and the most common kind is going to be a polyline. So, in this case, it doesn't matter how many objects I have going through this. My boundary here is my polyline. Now, let's go through some of the other options so you can see what goes into that. So we pick that boundary, right? First thing you do is pick your pattern. Let's say I want to go with the brick pattern. Okay, brick pattern probably is set too large because a lot of times these hatch patterns are at different scales. So let's try this brick pattern at 10. I don't think it's going to be the other way around where it needs to be like 500. No, it's going to be somewhere, let's see, maybe like a 0.5, 0.1. Sometimes you got to really play around with the scale to see if are we too big or are we too small. Well, maybe it's not going to work. There it goes. I don't know why it wasn't showing us the first time around, but sometimes it's good to start at 1. It should have just changed automatically, but we're going to stick with this ARB 816. All right, there's our 1 hatch scale. From here, you can choose. This is really where you can choose whether you want it to be solid or gradient or pattern, or some user-defined. User-defined is actually, I'll get to that in a second, it is a different kind of pattern. It's got a few options of its own. You can choose whether you want the hatch to be by layer or a specific color or by block. You can choose whether the background is a specific color, should you want that or need that. You've also got transparency for your hatch, but this one, again, it's not really updating the hatch transparency. So I don't know if it's just an artifact of mine because it was doing it earlier. Let's see if we change the color. It still doesn't want to do it. And let's try this. No, I don't know. I don't know why mine. It could be my program. I don't know how long any of you've been using AutoCAD, but you know that it's prone to errors and crashing and things like that. I probably could do the hatch transparency afterwards, but it's not wanting to do it right now. The angle is just changing the angle of the hatch itself. You can see it rotating. I doubt you're really going to be doing this manually by hand. Most likely, if you change the angle, it's going to be clicking and setting in an actual parameter like 45 degrees. So, and then you have your scale, which you saw me adjusting earlier. 1 is a good default scale, but if you need to go bigger, you can change it to be bigger. Get too big and you won't be able to see your hatch at all. So 1's a good point to start with. Origin, you can set an origin for where your hatch will kind of start from, and that's basically saying start the pattern from this point. If you need, sometimes your hatch, maybe if you have if you know like your hatch will fit within a certain width and you want it to fit perfectly, you can set an origin point. And then you got options here for, bottom left, bottom right, top, and all this and that, centered. A lot of times it may be centered, or what have you. So that's one way to do that. Associative is super, super important because it determines whether or not your hatch will stay with your boundary if the boundary changes. So you'll notice this one over here. If I turn my ortho off and I change this, my hatch is going to go with it, which is really handy. If this was not set to associative, let's go back and do a hatch again and turn the associative off and put this in here. When I go and move this boundary, my hatch does not go with it. You'll also notice that when I have my hatch selected, I have extra grips on a non-associative hatch compared to an associative hatch. There are no grips here because it will follow the shape of this boundary. If you do a hatch and pick points, it is by default non-associative. We'll try that again. We'll go to hatch, pick points. We could try to put it on associative. Actually, I'm sorry. It's not that it's not associative. It's just that if you remove the boundary, it becomes non-associative. So pick point still works and it'll keep your boundary. But once you remove the boundary of an associative hatch, so notice how it has no grips, remove the boundary, grips. It's no longer associative because the boundary is no longer there. Now, what happens if you have a hatch, especially if the hatch maybe had kind of a custom thing going on here, Ooh, that got funky. Okay. Let's say these original objects got deleted, but you really needed to create this hatch. One thing you can do is to recreate the hatch boundary. And the way to do this is by just selecting the hatch and hitting recreate. And it'll say region or polyline. We're just going to do a polyline. And it'll say, do you want to associate the hatch with the new boundary? Maybe you don't need to associate the hatch with the new boundary. But in this case, we're going to say yes. So we get our hatch boundary back, and we can this will move around again, and it'll be reassociated with the boundary once more. So reunited, and it feels so good with our hatch and our hatch boundary. Now, there is another way to do hatching, or I guess I should say there is a hatch window. Let me see if I can activate it. There's the command line version, but we're not going to go that way. I'm going to close my ribbon and show you what happens if you use icons only. If you don't have icons, I'm sorry, if you're using icons and you don't have a ribbon open, you're going to get the actual hatch window. So I'm going to make a new hatch rectangle here, or boundary rectangle. Do the hatch command, which is just H. And a lot of things you saw up in that ribbon are here. You've got whether you're doing a predefined, like a pattern, user-defined, or custom. Your gradients are now in a tab. So if you're doing a gradient, they're going to be over here now. You can choose your pattern here, or click the ellipsis here, and then you can see your ANSI, ISO, other, and custom. So all of your patterns will be here. So if I'm doing that brick again, I can choose my angle and my scale. I think the scale was just 1 last time. We'll change it to 2 this time. The only thing is, you're setting up all these settings before you're getting into the hatch, so you won't be able to preview this. You just kind of have to know what you're dealing with. You can preview them with the preview button, but you can't see it like dynamically, like live. We can do the pick points or select our objects, so I can say select objects. And then I can now hit preview, or I can do the whole origin thing again if I want to choose the origin. I can make it associative or not associative. And then in this option, and I didn't see this in the ribbon, but it might be there, you're able to create separate hatches, and I'll show you that in a second. Then you got your transparency, and then, you know, whatever the layer is. And you can also choose the color here by layer, color, like all the stuff we did earlier, just in a different layout. And you can hit preview and see everything there, and just hit OK, and then there's your hatch. So the multiple hatches thing. Let's say I've got a couple circles, right? And I go to hatch these multiple objects. After I've hatched them, you'll notice that even though the circles are separate objects, the hatch is one object with a singular grip. Okay, of course, once I move it out of its boundary, I've got individual grips for each one of the hatches. But they're all one object, right? There's a couple ways I could have handled this. I could have maybe just had one object and hashed it, right? Now we're good to go. But what happens if I've got different types of objects? Okay, I can't just copy it around, and if I hatch them all at the same time, it's going to make one combined hatch. Now I could hatch them individually, one at a time, you know, that one, and then enter, and then close it out, and then this one. Or I can select all of them and choose create separate hatches, and then now they're all separate. Keep in mind, however, that let's say you do want to combine hatch. If the last time that you ran the hatch, if you did separate hatches, that option will be selected by default. So when you go back to this and you're like, okay, just hatch these two together, and you expect them to be combined, they're going to be separate because that was the last thing you did, and it remembers your selection every time. The hatch window will always remember the last hatch that you did. So, all right, what about editing? We talked about editing a hatch. Like what happens if you lose your boundary and you want it back? The way to do this with no ribbon, rather than having to open the ribbon up, is to type in hatch edit and select your hatch. And you get what looks like the hatch window, but it's the hatch edit window. You can modify the hatch here or recreate the boundary. And then it asks you the same stuff it asked before. Polyline or region, polyline, associate hatch with the new boundary, yes, and then hit OK, and we've got our boundary back. So same stuff, different method depending on whether you have the ribbon open or closed. Okay, so that's about everything. There are gradients. I don't use gradients very much, but they're in the same vein as hatching. You can do a solid color to, I guess, black, or a 2-color, and it kind of works in the same way. You select your object, choose your gradient style. So if you were to do something like this, I'd say you could choose it to be centered or not centered, and then change the angle of it. Let's say I want something like this, and it just puts it in the middle there. I can always go back and edit the hatch with hatch edit, or I can actually edit it from my properties menu, and then change, you know, the color or the style. Where it was the spherical, and here it is here. You can change your styles here. Okay. There, the user define is one of the other things I wanted to get to. So through here, it's under this section. So I'll do it for this method first, and I'll go back to the ribbon. When you choose user define as opposed to predefined, it's kind of simple. This is your swatch, your pattern, just parallel lines. That's all it is. If I were to select this, it's parallel lines. You can choose the angle of the parallel lines, and you choose the spacing of them. So let's say I want to put these lines at 2 inches apart at a 0 degree angle. Preview. Well, let's make them a little further apart, like 12. There we go. 12 inches apart. I can change the angle to 45 if I want to. This is great for like if you want a hatch pattern, maybe for some tile or something, or a hardy plank or whatever, and you know the exact width between your lines or distance between your lines, you can use this method. You can also choose double to do the same thing, but mirrored. It's at a 90 degree angle. So preview that, and I've got the exact same thing, or I can do it back at a 0 degrees, or what have you, and it's 12 inches in both directions. So you can make an exact 12 by 12 grid, and if you know exactly what your dimensions are, you can take this and just explode it. Now you have lines at 12 inches. So there's a quick way to do that. Ribbon method, somewhat similar. Open the ribbon back up here and do a hatch again. This time we're going to go to user defined, and let's see, you can choose your double right here, and your scale is now your separation. So 12 inches. Or it's already set to 1 foot. I thought it said 1 inch. It's 1 foot. Select our object, and there it is. And then you can choose your double down here if you want to, in addition to your angle, like we did before. So same stuff, just different way to get to it, which is under user. It looks like user's all the way at the bottom here as well. If you just scroll down, you can get to user, or just put in user right here, user defined. So you can match properties with between hatches. You can do it through the hatch command, or my preferred method is just literally match property command, and you can just match 2 hatches. Super easy. It matches everything about them: layer, scale, pattern. All this gets updated to however I want it. Oops. That's if I want to change everything to this, match this, it all gets matched to that pattern. So matching hatches is actually kind of nice, because let's say you got a couple different patterns, like let's say I have another one over here, and this one's a user defined, all the way at the bottom. See, it's so far though. So I got a user defined, and I do select. Oops, I meant to do a select. Okay, and then we're gonna do 12 inches, and we'll leave it like that. Okay, done. And let's say this is, I don't know, just a different pattern altogether. Sand. Okay. I can, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll come in here, and let's say my hatch is like back to the default or something. I don't know, maybe it's, solid. I can just choose solid, select, and rather than trying to do all the same settings, I can say, you know what, I'm gonna just put a solid hatch and do a match property to sand, or a match property to lines, and it matches. Quick, fast, easy. That way, you just throw a hatch in. It doesn't matter what the hatch is, because you're gonna match properties. So, okay, I think we've covered everything as far as the windows go. Again, sometimes maybe you want to modify a hatch that has no boundary. Sometimes you wanted to just put the hatch there and get rid of the boundary because you don't need it. A good example of this is if you're doing, say, I do foundation drawings. I'll do an elevation of foundations. Let's say I got a foundation here, and I've got like a representation of the ground, okay? And I'll do like a little P line or something here, and I'll do like this. Turn my... Okay, and what I'll do is hatch, and I'll look for earth. Bring this out a little bit, I can see better. See everything together. So I'll look for the earth. Okay, I'll put it at maybe a 45 degree angle, and it's at 2 right now. I'm gonna go pick points inside here. 2 looks like it might be too large. Maybe 0.5. No, we're still not getting where we need to be. Maybe we're too small. 10, yeah, we were too small. All right, maybe like 50. Okay, so something like this, right? And then I'm gonna erase this line. And now I've got my little foundation elevation here with my hatch. that you can see I had a P line here and there's all the boundaries. Let's say for whatever reason I need to modify this a little bit. I can always grab pieces of it, either a vertex or a piece of like a center of a segment of that polyline. I can do that and grab, you know, sections of it and modify that boundary manually. And so that's a good way to just kind of reshape, you know, any hatch after the fact. If you need to just grab it, but you don't really need a border associated with it, you can do that. So one of the other things that you can do with these grips is, let's say you have, I don't know, a hatch that you need to move, okay? And this happened. I hate it when it does this. Don't show me this again. All right. Let's say that you need to move this hatch over to here, but you can't exactly move it. If you grab this grip, it's going to want to stretch it. We don't want that. And there's nothing to snap to. And although there is an option to turn that on, if you go to your options here and you hit up drafting and you say, you know, uncheck ignore hatch objects, you will be able to snap to the hatch objects. But if you look, it would matter because these lines aren't going to this corner exactly anyway. So how do we tackle that? How do we get this back up to here? One of the things you can do is when you select a grip, you can right click, okay? And you do have a copy option. However, it doesn't work the way you think it should when the vertex is selected. If you hit copy, what it's going to want to do is place this vertex and make a copy of this hatch. It's weird, okay? But what you can do is click this vertex. So bear with me here. This is the process. You select the vertex, and it doesn't matter which vertex, but this is the one we want to snap from, okay? This is what we want to use as our snap. We're going to go from here to here. So I'm going to select the vertex. I'm going to right click and say enter. This allows me to actually move. So if I just want to move back, boom, there I am. Simple, right? If I want to copy for whatever reason, I can select it, right click, enter. Now I'm in a move option, right click again, go to copy. And now when I select it here, it places a copy of it, and then right click, enter or exit, and I'm out of the command. So a little bit of a confusing process. You can also, well, I wouldn't hit the control option. That's a whole different tip tutorial anyways. But so yeah, like I said, selecting a vertex, right clicking and just hitting enter will allow you to move that whole hatch. So, you know, if you have this one over, you know, if you have this over here and let's say this didn't even exist and you wanted to copy this or move this to a certain location, you could click it, just hit enter and just move it. And, you know, there it is exactly on the corner, you know, where you would expect it to be. So one of those really helpful things for a grip with no boundaries, you can still do things with that hatch, even without it. Or you could recreate the boundary. You know, you always have that option to recreate that boundary by selecting the hatch and saying recreate polyline, yes, and then there's your boundary, and then you can do the exact same thing. Take this, move it back. Maybe just as easy. Who knows? I want to say the last thing that I really want to touch on is the awareness of where your hatches are in the z-axis. When you hatch, your hatch will always show up wherever your elevation is set to, whatever the elevation of your current UCS is set to. So because I'm drawing everything in the z-axis, if I hatch, and I have my ribbon closed here again because I don't want to have to deal with it right now, my hatch is going to show up here at the z-axis. But let's say I draw a line up here and I do another hatch. Okay, I'm going to erase this. Even though my object is up here, if I go to hatch, that hatch is not going to show up at this elevation. It's going to show up on the ground because that's where my UCS is at. This is super important to think about and consider when you're working in 3D. If you're doing a hatch in 3D and you have an elevated object or elevated boundary, your hatch will be located wherever your UCS is at. So if you need to set your UCS, set your hatch to an elevated object, the best way to do that is to set your UCS to that object and then create the hatch. And now we have the hatch at the proper elevation. Okay, so just really keep that in mind, that when you do hatches that are on boundaries that are elevated, your hatch is always going to be drawn wherever your UCS is at. So I think that was kind of just the last real important thing when it comes to hatches. I want to feel like everything else has been taken care of here. You'll have your various patterns. There is a way to do custom patterns. I have done them. I'm not really big on it. I may later in the future do a video on it because I'm not like an expert with creating custom hatches, but I have created my own hatch for my own purposes, but I've only done it like once or twice, and so I don't have it off the top of my head right now. I have to go review that. But you know, if that's something that you might be interested in, I'll definitely consider making a video on that later. But yeah, use hatches as you see fit. They're used in all kinds of industries, and now you know your limitations and how to put them in, change scale, rotation or angle, pattern, things like that. There is one last thing. I'm glad I remember this. I saw the option here where it says remove boundaries, and I don't want anybody to think, hey, you missed that button there, you didn't talk about it. If you have a hatch or a boundary with objects inside of it, and you go and you pick points, what it's going to do is it's going to put the hatch around those objects. Remember, they are part of the boundary that's being created. Even though they're not cutting through, they're cutting around. What you can do is say remove boundaries. And if you want the hatch to go through these objects, you can remove them as boundaries and it will just ignore them entirely. So, and there may be cases where you want to do that. You don't want that to be a boundary. Maybe you have lines. Maybe you're doing that thing again where you're creating a hatch and you happen to be drawing something and you have a few lines that are created, and you're doing let's say this isn't like maybe it's not a P line, maybe it's a hatch of a few different lines, doing like this and that, and I don't know, some crazy stuff, right? You got all this going on. Maybe you want a hatch inside this area, but you want it to go through all this, right? But if you go to hatch, you'd have to select each individual area, which you could do. Or maybe you could say you do have to select all of them, but you say remove boundaries. And, well, in that case, it kind of removed everything here, but I think you get the point. I'm probably doing a bad example of this, but you're able to remove certain boundaries to allow your hatch to expand further than you originally intended it to by using pick points. If you're using, select objects, it's always going to pick that boundary, which is why it's my preferred method, but sometimes you may need to remove a boundary here and there at times. So just one of those things to keep in mind, because in that same example with those objects completely inside, if I were to do select objects, it's going to ignore them completely. So the preferred method, unless you need one of these objects to have the hatch put around it. So okay, I think we're good to go on hatches. Hopefully this helped give a real in-depth view of what you can do with hatches and how all the options work.